It's election season. Elections have consequences. I get it. Everybody has their team and advocates for their team and votes for their team accordingly. And kind of the whole point of the game is to try to sway as many non decided voters to your team as you can. But elections have consequences. They have lasting consequences, and they have consequences that affect everybody. So, politely, I'm calling you out on your bullshit and lies. I'm not doing it to be a dick. I mean, no disrespect. I have no issue with you as a person. I hope this doesn't affect our friendship. I understand why you're vehemently rooting for your team, and I certainly appreciate that. More people would do well to be as actively participant in their politics. But elections have consequences, and I'm calling you out on obfuscating the reality of things as it is and misrepresenting facts in order to push an agenda that is detrimental. So let's get right into it because I'm going to cite my sources. This is all coming off alberta.ca, our government's own words. Now, brief history on it. This isn't any much different than the laws were under the old conservative government before the NDP made these changes. The only change that was made was to a multiplier. 1 hour of banked overtime could be paid out at an hour of straight time if, in that pay period, if it wasn't the same one they were banked in, if in that pay period you did not meet the 44 hours a week requirement to get overtime. So the change that the NDP made to it was that if it was worked as overtime, it must be paid out as overtime under any and all circumstances. So if you bank 20 hours of overtime, if you took it out a month later, when you had a pay period where you only worked 50 hours, say you had 3 days off work due to bad weather, you could pull your 20 hours of banked overtime and still see an 80-hour paycheck. That's equivalent to 1 day's wage of that employee in loss. Now, in a different pay period, if you've moved on to the next job site by that point, that 3 days loss in production, I know you haven't worked in residential construction, but here's an idea of how it works. We get paid 70% once the roof is completed and they can put the shingles on. We get paid 20% when the extras and all the other little crap is finished. We get paid the last 10% when it's all signed off and done. So under those conditions, to say lose 2 days to bad weather, that actually puts a delay going into the income of the company, because I don't think you know much about contracting either. No offense, it's kind of clear that you've been an hourly employee at a shop your entire professional career. It's not a bad thing, so don't take it personally, but when there's a delay in the cycle of income for the company by a few days, and in that pay period where you have 2 days of lost production And now you not only have lost that you still have to pay out, but now you're going to lose an entire day in somebody's wage just because. So, I mean, first off, that's not much incentive for companies to even want to even give the of banked hours to their employees. And it is very much an option. So, let's get right into it. Basic rules. Most employees are entitled to overtime pay, so not everybody's entitled to it to begin with. There are some exemptions for certain industries and professions. More people who these overtime things don't apply to. Overtime is all hours worked over 8 hours a day or 44 hours a week, whichever is greater. That's the rule of 8 and 44. Pay rate. Except where there's a written overtime agreement, an employer must pay an employee overtime pay of at least 1.5 times the employee's regular wage rate for all overtime hours worked. Fine. I mean, it sounds nice on paper, but I've already explained the mathematics of how the application of it's kind of bullshit. Banked overtime. Sometimes, instead of paying an overtime, an employer may give an employee time off work with pay at a rate of 1.5 hours for each overtime hour worked, as part of an overtime agreement between the employer and employee. Employees must use up banked overtime within 6 months of the end of the pay period in which they earned it, unless there is a collective agreement that allows overtime banking to be extended. But that's a collective agreement. So, what we can take from that is banked hours aren't legally required to be offered by an employer. If you get them, they're doing you a favor they're not obligated to. Same as if you get a paid 15-minute coffee break in the morning. They're not obligated to pay you for that. Labor law says they're only obligated to give you a half an hour break every 4 hours at least. That's the reality of it. Deal with it. Employee eligibility. Pretty much anybody that's on a payroll. Non-eligible employees. So making changes to any minimum wage law, not minimum wage, any banked overtime law doesn't affect managers, supervisors, and those employed in a confidential capacity. Waged non-family farm and ranch employees, professionals including argologists, whatever the hell that means, architects, certified or chartered accountants, chiropractors, dentists, denturists, engineers, geoscientists, information system professionals, lawyers, students at law, optometrists, podiatrists, psychologists, and veterinarians. Doesn't apply to salesperson of vehicles, road construction, heavy-duty equipment, manufactured homes or residential homes, salespersons who solicit orders principally outside of the employer's place of business, licensed salespeople in real estate, licensed insurance salesmen, salespersons who are at least 16 years old and are engaged in direct selling for licensed direct sellers, land agents, extras in film and video. Counselors or instructors at an educational or recreational camp that is operated on a charitable or not-for-profit basis for children. Domestic employees. Industries with different overtime rules. Number of industries and occupations are subject to variations in daily, weekly, and or monthly hours worked before overtime is payable. Meaning, depending on your industry, the amount of hours you need for overtime isn't even regulated. Doesn't apply to ambulance attendants, geophysical exploration, irrigation districts, logging, oil well servicing, surveying, trucking, field catering and land surveying, highway and railway construction and brush clearing, nursery industry, road maintenance activities, taxi cab industry, firefighting services, and caregivers. Okay, calculating overtime pay. Whether basic or special overtime rules apply, the formula for calculating overtime is all the same. Overtime hours are calculated both on a daily and weekly basis, except in a few instances that require overtime to be calculated on a monthly basis. Overtime is whichever is the greater amount of hours. It's important to note that even though the pay period may end midweek, overtime pay is based on overtime hours for the work week, not your pay period. So maybe if your overtime hasn't been adding up to what you figured it should have added up to, it's because you probably weren't aware of that. To be perfectly honest, I wasn't either. Exceptions. Oh, wait, we weren't done with the last case. Basic overtime pay rate. Overtime must be paid at least 1.5 times the employee's wage rate. This overtime rate of pay is multiplied by the total number of overtime hours that the employee has worked. Basic math. Now, for exceptions. Time off with pay regarding banked overtime. Sometimes, instead of paying overtime pay, an employer will give an employee time off work with pay, banked overtime, at a rate of 1.5 hours banked for each hour worked as part of a written overtime agreement between the employer and employee. So, these are terms set between the two. They're not legislated. Banked overtime is a luxury that you're not owed. So, why are you trying to legislate businesses' choice on how to operate? You're not changing much. Exception to the 8 and 44 rule. If an employer establishes a work week of fewer than 44 hours, for example, a 40-hour work week, overtime pay is still payable under the basic 844 rule. The exception to this is when a collective agreement, some other agreement, or the consistent practice of an employer has been established in writing that overtime hours are to be counted after working fewer than 8 hours in a workday or 44 in a week. We don't need to get into commission or other plans, but let's get into the overtime agreements themselves. Employees and employers may enter into a mutual overtime agreement where instead of paying overtime pay, an employer gives paid time off with regular pay. For every hour of overtime worked, an hour and a half of time off must be banked. So that addresses that remark you made, John, about your banked hours relative to time off. Your employer isn't obligated to monetize it. They're not forced to pay you out. If you want to take time off for your vacation, take an extended vacation. I have a feeling that what you're advocating for is legislation that can be imposed upon employers, much to their financial detriment, so you can maximize your gains. And it really doesn't work. Not to mention, I mean, this is all new to me too, but you haven't mentioned at all that your employer, when it comes to time off and using the banked overtime, you haven't mentioned that little ratio there of 1 to 1.5. But it already addresses what you were saying about the time off, and I mean, that's pretty fair. An hour of work for an hour and a half off? Sounds good to me. So let's read on. Employers must give a copy of the written agreement to employees who are covered by it, including new employees. There are two types of agreements. An individual overtime agreement is between a single employee and an employer. Now, okay, here we go. Group overtime agreements. A group overtime agreement is between an employer and a designated group of employees. The employer and a majority, greater than 50%, of the employees in the designated group must sign the agreement. In this case, the provisions of the overtime agreement will bind all employees of that particular group. An overtime agreement can also be part of a collective agreement. Overtime agreement requirements. So this is the bare minimum your employer has to offer you for your overtime agreement. The bare minimum. This is the law. Time off with pay banked at a rate of 1.5 hours for each overtime hour worked instead of overtime pay will be provided, taken, and paid at the employee's regular wage rate at a time that the employee could have worked and received wages from the employer. The phrase, at a time the employee could have worked, means that time off can be provided any time that the employee could have been scheduled to work 9 non-overtime hours. So let's break that one down, because that one's kind of interesting. Time off with pay banked at time and a half for each overtime hour worked instead of overtime pay will be provided, taken and paid at the employee's regular wage rate at a time when the employee could have worked. So that right there addresses the other thing. If you schedule time off for the sake of scheduling time off because you want to go to the Calgary Stampede, or you want a day off to be hungover because you went to a concert, if you went out to just go and live your life as you should, and you fall back on your banked pay, if you could have been working that day, the trade-off for not being there is that you get paid out on straight time if you draw on your hours. Fancy that. So that right there, I would take it, is the part that you want to see legislated and changed, right? I mean, that's what you're going for. All banked overtime should be all banked overtime, regardless of anything, because you worked overtime, and there's so many loopholes in that logic that can be exploited and abused. And it doesn't end up coming out of your pocket. You make off pretty good with it, but it's going to hemorrhage anybody who employs people a hell of a lot of money. But that's the part that I'm guessing you want to see legislated. That's what you're voting for. Right, John? You want to take an extra week off? Pull 40 hours out, but get paid for 60. Yeah. There's already a law in place specifically against that. If time off with regular pay instead of overtime pay is not provided, taken, and paid as required, that is, at the employee's wage rate and at the time the employee could have worked and received wages, the employee must be paid overtime pay of at least time and a half for the hours worked. Okay. Time off with regular pay instead of overtime pay must be provided, taken, and paid to the employee within 6 months of when they banked it, unless the agreement is part of a collective agreement and the collective agreement provides for a longer period within which the time off with pay can be provided and taken. Cool. No amendment or termination of the agreement is to be effective without at least 1 month's written notice. Well, all right. So I would say that just pretty much covers it. Now, what you're arguing against and going all F Jason Kenney and demonizing him for is, from what I'm reading here on the CBC, says his UCP leader Jason Kenney says his proposal to deal with banked overtime is simply a return to former rules. The NDP government made changes, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so the NDP made changes, took effect January 1st, 2018, that meant 1 hour of banked overtime would translate into an hour and a half of time off. So the current law doesn't even say that it's monetized, John. The current law actually states that they just have to give you your overtime. It's equivalent in time off if you take it. So nobody's really monetizing this. Kenney said he wants to return to a straight hour-to-hour exchange. Now, see, here's the thing. Under the old rules with the hour-to-hour exchange, if an employee banked overtime or banked their hours, you bank the hours. And, I mean, this was huge in the end of summer and the fall going into the winter when you know everything slows down a bunch. You bank as many hours as you can because you know 3 months to do as much as you can, followed by 3 months of not being productive. You can bank enough hours that if you only get in a 30-hour work week, you can use the hours you banked. It was a way to stabilize your income through the off season. The banked overtime thing, that was something that was put in place for seasonal workers. No offense, man, but I mean, you work in a shop most of the time. You have a roof over your head. You don't have to deal with frostbite and wind chill and wind burns and mean, I get it, the work you do is of great importance and stuff, but the conditions in which you do it and the rate at which you're paid are pretty comfortable. Like, you make a good living. The people that you're advocating for legislation for that it ends up hurting are people like me. Because when you pass so much extra cost, I mean, you're talking about an entire day of somebody's wage being made up for using overtime if they pull the hours out just to compensate for, 2 days of downtime. It's not any incentive for employers to even offer it because they're not legally required to, John. So what's your argument with that Jason Kenney wants to make a change to a modifier to say that if you work overtime, take the overtime pay in the pay period? Because if you bank your overtime hours and you draw upon them in a pay period where your hours are lacking, there's not going to be a loophole that brings you out a day's wage ahead at your employer's expense. So, with that being said, in closing, it's absurd. And I would challenge you to walk up to your employer, demand a raise to reflect upping the minimum wage to $15 an hour, then proceed to tell him you expect full health, medical, dental coverage, and life insurance, and then tell him you'll give him 100 hours in your first pay period of the month to bank the overtime, but only 60 in the second pay period of the month because those banked hours were overtime, so now he's going to cut you a nice juicy 90-hour paycheck. And if your employer seems to take issue with that, he better deal with it, or else you're going to lobby for legislation that'll force him to. Wonder how long you'd keep your job. And if that's essentially your argument as to why Jason Kenney is absolutely horrible, I don't think you have a grasp on the economic consequences of it. There's already a lot of people that it doesn't benefit, and you can say everything you want about how only the big corporations. But there's an available labor market. And dude, don't you know? Most of those people that are full-time there say that they only end up getting 40 hours a pay period and that their overtime's based on 44. Because the government minimum required for full-time employment is 40 hours by definition. For the economic benefits of it, most employers opt for 44. So unless you're going to also advocate for legislation forcing employers to hemorrhage money and vote for poor policies that end up pricing the workforce out of the job availability, you're only going to start to see way, way, way more abuse than we're already seeing from those same corporations abusing the temporary foreign worker program, which I explained to you before, John. So, before you shoot off and demonize people on a public platform, check your facts and know what you're talking about.